Awesome. Hello, everyone. Happy to be back talking again since the pandemic. So thanks for having me here today. My talk today is around navigating the NPM ecosystem in the enterprise. And I really want to share an approach we've been taking at my company and at IBM to really help some of the concerns around the vast ecosystem we have to navigate. Quick bit about me. I had a great introduction. I'm a senior software engineer at Red Hat. I work on the Node core project. I do a lot of the release work up in the upstream community. And I'm also spend a lot of my time getting knocked out. I also spend a lot of my time helping internal teams and clients with any Node problems they experience. That's the approach I'd like to share. A lot of clients have raised concerns around the NPM ecosystem, so I'd like to share some of the work we're doing to try and alleviate some of those. So there's always been quite a lot of concern about the ecosystem, particularly in enterprises, as you can imagine. They're slightly behind the curve, so getting used to just downloading things off the internet takes some time. And they're quite right to be concerned. There's 1.9 million modules on the registry. That means there's a lot of really good choices out there, but also some potentially problematic choices. And this is compounded by the fact that when you're deploying your applications into cloud, the majority of the code you're actually deploying is not even your own. But actually, you have to take responsibility for it. You can't just ignore it and assume it will just work. You're responsible for all of that code in production when you're running it. And I always like to start with a few horror stories. I'm sure you'll remember the left pad unpublished incident back in 2016. And also, it happens again, it happens all the time. We had the Faker.js earlier this year that caused some trouble in the ecosystem. And this isn't a new problem. It's quite well known. It's not specific to the Node.js or JavaScript ecosystems. But what I do find is our ecosystem does surface it a bit more visibly, and that's just because of how wide and deep our dependency trees typically are in comparison to things like Java. But it's always a critique of our ecosystem, but actually, it happens in the Java world too. So in the organizations I've worked at, there's been many different approaches to this problem over time. And over the years, we've adapted how we approach the problem. So one of my first ever conference talks actually was around one of our early approaches, which was about providing guidance to developers on how they can make better choices when selecting modules from the NPM registry. And at the time, we called out things such as check the security, check the security patches, check the license is compatible with your application, ensure that you're confident that the module will continue to be maintained for the lifetime of your product, and how frequent are the breaking changes, is the module even compatible for all of the platforms you will need to eventually deploy to. So all of this was around providing guidance for the developer to make good decisions about which modules they should consume. And a lot of other companies are doing a similar thing, so you may be aware of NPMS or Sneak Package Health Scores. Again, it's really about helping developers make a more informed choice. But metrics really do not tell you the whole story. Some of the most downloaded modules in NPM may not actually be a good module to use when deploying to a cloud-native enterprise application. And one of the key things I like to really call out is governance is really important. For our company, one of the key benefits of consuming open source is the fact that when we hit a problem or hit a bug, we can go in and fix it ourselves, so we can help ourselves. But this means when choosing a dependency, you need to have some level of confidence that if you were to put that effort in, it would actually be accepted. And that may not be the case for some projects controlled by certain organizations or perhaps an individual's project. Another approach we've been taking at IBM Red Hat is to participate in the Node.js package maintenance working group. So the Node.js community have a large number of working groups. Package maintenance is one of those, and it brings together everyone, a large portion of people who are interested in working on this problem. And it's great because we have other enterprises there, people from Netflix, people from NPM, Red Hat, and IBM, and we all work together. And really, the goals of this working group can be summarized as we're trying to promote responsible consumption of ecosystem modules. We're also trying to produce guidance for package maintainers. And also, in some cases, some module authors have actually handed our modules over to the package maintenance working group for us to step in and help to maintain. So now I want to share a little bit of a recent approach we've been taking. And actually, we're taking this approach in unison with all of our other approaches. It's not instead of, it's just in addition. And my slides have gone a bit wonky in the convert, but anyway. So our new approach is to produce a reference architecture. And what we describe this as is our opinion on what components should be used for our internal teams and clients, and also some additional guidance for how to be successful in production with those components. And it's really just essentially a set of good defaults, good default choices when you're selecting from the NPM registry. Disclaimer here, I'm not here to try and say our opinions are right. The recommendations will not apply to other organizations. I'd just like to share our approach to this problem, which is slightly different to the other approaches we've taken. And we're actually very conscious, even internally, of saying you must use this module. We don't frame it that way. It's here are a set of good defaults. So if you have no reason to use anything else, you may as well stick to these this subset. And yeah, kind of the Lego picture, it reminds me of my opinions on Lego. When I was growing up, I just had like a bucket of Lego, played with it. If someone had come along and said, you're using these bricks and building it in this way, I wouldn't have liked it at all. So, and also, it's not about picking winners. We can't categorically say this module is better than this other module. It's more around, based on the experience within our organization and the knowledge we have, this is the defaults we recommend. And also, while it is a factor, personal preference is kind of left at the door. We can all advocate for our favorite framework, but it's really what makes sense for the organization as a whole. And on the other hand, this whole restricted usage approach, even though many developers won't like to be told exactly what they can use to build with, it's not actually unfamiliar to our enterprise clients and customers who they will be told this is the set of vetted dependencies you can use. And this is particularly common in like financial services and government industries. Often they even have an internal mirror that has a restricted subset. And there are benefits to the approach these companies are taking. It's because they can do more efficient vetting and due diligence. So we set out to build this reference architecture. How did we actually go about doing that? Well, step one was just to bring together all of our internal teams and clients who had experience with building enterprise Node.js applications. So in the context of my company, that's over 300,000 employees between IBM and Red Hat. So just finding everyone who was deploying was a challenge in itself. But so far, we've built up a big group of people with lots of experience, consultants, clients, in deploying and building Node.js applications. And if you're not familiar with the term, this is kind of like an inner source approach we've taken to the problem. If you're not familiar, inner source is applying open source best practices within your internal organization and taking inspiration from how things are handled in open source communities and applying those behaviors internally. And we get a lot of benefits from this approach. We get the broad expertise across the whole organization. It's not just our team's opinion. We get very critical peer review across different teams. And it also means that any teams with expertise can bring that to the table. So once we've brought this group, defined this group, we then brought everyone together to really define the components we felt formed an enterprise Node.js application. And this is based on their experience. So the consultants, what they've actually seen happening in their client assignments. And initially, we just started drafting a list. We kind of grouped things into like development components, functional components, and operations. Just an example of what we had under development was things like code coverage, code consistency, testing. And then under functional components, we have things like, what are you using for authentication? What cache are you using? What modules? And it's actually through these functional components we get most of the individual registry recommendations in terms of which modules you should use. And then we have operations. This was of heightened importance in our context because our customers are likely running, massive deployments, Kubernetes clusters, many instances of the applications. So day two kind of operations are quite critical. So we're looking at things like health checks, logging, metrics, and any guidance we can produce that. So once we'd listed out all of these components, we discussed them within the group to try and converge on an opinion on a good default. And I'll just go through an example in the context of logging. So we brought together everyone operating large deployments. We discussed at length all the different modules they were using, whether using, Winston. And from all of those discussions, we eventually converged on the opinion that Pinot was a great default. And that was based on the real experience, and the things they called out about Pinot being a great default was because it had the great structured logging, it had an easily consumed API, and it just worked with all of the aggregation tools that you're likely to use in a cloud-native setting. So once we converged on an opinion for a specific component, we published this to our reference architecture. It is publicly available, but again, I find the process is interesting. The outcome may not be as interesting to other organizations, but for us, it's been a very valuable process. So yeah, we published the guidance to a reference architecture, and the great thing is we can provide additional guidance over and above which module to use. So based on pooling the experience from all the developers we know deploying large Node.js applications, we gain additional guidance, such as in this case, hey, initially you might want to store your logs in a high access, expensive location for maybe 7 days, and then after that you may want to migrate them to a lower cost, harder to access location. So it's just extra tips and tricks that we're gaining by exploiting the whole developer pool in our organization. And again, just in terms of consistency, once we converged on a recommendation, we tend to go and update all of our tutorials, all of our assets, all of our customer guidance to use that same example. So there's been quite a lot of benefits we've found to this approach. First is just finding contacts. So my team works a lot in the Node community. It's great for our product teams to have a contact in that community. And also it's great for us to get direct user feedback from people actually deploying massive production applications. Also, knowledge sharing, just generally bringing teams together across the whole org and sharing knowledge in this working group fashion has been great. It also means we have some recommendations for clients on hand, and also more efficient due diligence. So by saying, here's a good set of defaults, we can do the due diligence on those modules, check that they're maintained, and it saves the individual product teams having to do that process all over again by themselves. And actually, my favorite benefit is the more focused open source contributions. So I know in a lot of orgs, developers can struggle to convince their companies to invest in open source, invest in their dependencies. And we found that by defining a narrow subset of defaults, that conversation is easier. Because you can say, hey, I've hit this bug in this dependency I'm using. The whole org really uses this as the default module for logging. Perhaps we should invest to fix it because it doesn't only benefit our team, it benefits the whole org. So I really think this approach has lent itself quite well to solving kind of open source maintenance problem that we face. So just to recap, our new approach has been to build a reference architecture, and we've done this by bringing folks together across a large organization, talking about their experiences, defining the components, and for each component, talking about experiences and success stories. Eventually, we converge on a recommendation, and we document that. And then we also need to continuously evaluate recommendations. And this is because what you choose today to build a new production-grade application may not actually be a good choice in future. And actually, one particular case, we find a lot of value in predicting future trends. And to go into details of one specific conversation that's happening in our group is around our web framework recommendation. So today our reference architecture states Express.js is our default recommendation. It's so massively popular. We have internal products using it. We have all of our customers and clients are using it. They're still coming in today and saying, we would like to build with Express. And there's wide knowledge, it's tried and tested, and I think one of the key reasons that we still recommend folks to use it is because its limitations are known. Yes, it has limitations, but they are known. So really, a lot of our customers and internal teams are just comfortable using Express. So today, that's what we recommend. That's not to say in these discussions there weren't many concerns raised. So at the time, there hadn't been a release for a couple of years when we started these discussions, and there are generally concerns about the release cadence of Express. And the reason I see that as a concern myself is that the Node runtime is being released very frequently, and if a module isn't being released as frequently, and you start to question at some point, is it going to lag behind the features that are available in the runtime itself? There are also concerns around the support for async await syntax, and also some concerns around contributions. So you'll find with many of the known web frameworks at the moment have this pattern of their GitHub history, where it was a peak a few years back and now it's tailing off, which indicates it's in a maintenance state. So really the question we're asking ourselves in this group is, if it's in the state now, where will it be in 5 years' time? So I set up often a little experiment to go see if I could dig out some metrics, see where it was likely to head next. And I can probably skim through and show you some of those. I still have time. So I started with some really crude metrics like weekly downloads, number of dependents, number of stars, all of them not very insightful on their own, but can sometimes indicate a relative position. So as you can see, Express is massive still, and then we see next underneath, and then everything else just below. It's just huge. Downloads aren't a great metric because the registry downloads are increasing year over year. So they're not that insightful, but I still find the relative positions interesting. Another way to look at the same download data was by share of registry downloads per year. So what this is saying is, like, for all of the downloads that go to the registry, what percentage of them are from Express or asking for Express? And the interesting thing here is we can see it tailing off, and similar with React. And because of the data in this graph, the tail off isn't indicating like a reduction in usage. It's more just saying the downloads are less proportionately compared to everything else. And actually, it's not to say it's losing it to other web frameworks either. It's possible that the npm registry, the number of downloads to it, are just becoming more diverse. But anyway, it was still interesting to see, like, for a time it was gaining share. And one thing this graph does highlight is types node. You can see it skyrocketing. So like TypeScript adoption is like continuing to increase at pace. And what was interesting is seeing what was happening with the frameworks at the bottom, just to see what was happening in terms of downloads, were they increasing? And the ones that are interesting are the modules that are increasing in spite of the general trend being that the npm registry is diversifying. So we essentially earmarked these as ones to watch. We did some other scores. For example, the Open Source Security Foundation generates a score based on how critical they think a project should be. Again, just interesting. This had slightly different, resulted in slightly different ordering to what we'd seen in the other results. We also continue to look at contribution activity, so over time. So the top graph is actually Express. You can see it peaking and tailing off. And then one of the up-and-coming frameworks, we can see a more consistent contribution pattern. So in 5 years' time, we're asking ourselves, which of these two modules would we more likely recommend in future? And also, perhaps my favorite metric here is contributor share. And this is very important for us. So what this does is it looks at all of the commits to the web framework, and works out what proportion were by each user. So we can see in framework 1, like almost 90% of the commits are from one user. So as an organization the size of like IBM and Red Hat, we're asking ourselves, should we be building enterprise-grade applications based on top of a web framework built by a single individual? That's the question we're asking. And then we have framework 2, which is slightly more shared, and framework 3 that is much more shared. This data is interesting because it gives us confirmation that if we did want to contribute a bug fix ourselves, we feel like it'd be more likely to be accepted in the case where the framework's more community-owned. So I did package up all of this data into a blog post. You should be able to find it. And really, when will we change? Sorry, I'm just skipping back. I didn't think I'd have time to go through the metrics. When will we change our recommendation from Express to something else? It's really going to be driven by our group, our reference architecture group. That group will need to come to the table and say, we've had success stories, we've had experience with this framework, we know its scope, we know its limitations. But we do see the value in continuously evaluating using metrics to kind of figure out where we might want to invest in advance. So just to summarize, our recent approach to helping our clients and customers navigate this ecosystem has been to try and focus our efforts on building a reference architecture. The key benefit I've seen to this approach is just pooling together all the expertise in the organization. So you get different opinions in the room. And like finally, the metrics can give some interesting insight for future planning, but really we won't change our recommendation, particularly in the context of a web framework, until we have, experience documented and some success stories. So with that, you can find our reference architecture. It is public, it is on GitHub. But again, I just found the approach interesting to share with you all today. And if you'd like to chat to me about web frameworks or Node.js or anything, feel free to come find me at the break. Thanks for your time, everyone.